he will come to you and we'll turn your mic on if you'd like to speak. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague and the person who helped organize all of this, Ricky Volante. He's outside of being a Law and Sport editorial board member, he's an attorney at the Volante law firm, and he's the CEO of the PCL, which is the Professional Collegiate League. Ricky, thank you so much for putting this together for us, a very important and complex topic. I'm going to hand over to you now, and yeah, look forward to hearing the discussion, and thank you from me and everyone at Law and Sport to all of our wonderful speakers for giving up your time today. Looking forward to hearing from you. Bye.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks to Law and Sport for letting us come together today to discuss the Bryant Flores suit, DE&I in the NFL, the Rooney rule and its application within the league. We'll also get into Stephen Ross a little bit as well towards the end, and competition integrity more broadly. So with that, I want to introduce this awesome panel of guests today. I'm going to give the abbreviated version of their current titles and everything, because their CVs would probably take us the entire hour to get all the way through. So starting with Jeremi, we have Jeremi Duru, professor of law at the Washington College of Law at American University. We have Howard Bryant, who is an award-winning author and journalist with positions at Meadowlark Media, ESPN, and NPR. We have Amira Rose Davis, who is an assistant professor at Penn State. She's also has a visiting professorship at the University of Texas at Austin. Additionally, she's a co-host of the Burn It All Down podcast and the host of the season 3 of American Prodigies podcast. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Madhu Williams, former NFL player, Walter Payton Man of the Year recipient, and also currently working within global risk strategy and operations at Visa. So with that, thank you all so much for joining me today. So we are going to kick off this discussion first with Jeremi, who's going to lay out for us exactly what the Rooney Rule is and its historical, the purpose of it, the history of how it came about, and then we'll get into its application. So Jeremi, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Ricky, and thank you all for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel. So the Rooney Rule is a rule developed in the National Football League in 2003, which originally said that if you are looking for a head coach, you have to interview at least one person of color. The rule was then expanded to the general manager position, has been expanded since then, which I'll talk about briefly. Let me talk a little bit about how it came to be and why it came to be. So why it came to be is that, like most American institutions, the NFL has a long and ugly history with race. The first few players in the NFL included a gentleman named Fritz Pollard in 1920. If anyone knows about that time period, it was a deeply divisive and violent racial time period in our country. Somehow he rose to be head coach of a team called the Akron Pros, a now defunct team in the National Football League, becoming the first Black head coach in the league. Shortly thereafter, all Black people were kicked out of the league and not brought back into the league until 1946, but there was not another African-American head coach until 1989. So decades and decades and decades after Fritz Pollard was a head coach. And that head coach in 1989 was Art Shell. Following Shell's hire, and he did well with the Los Angeles Raiders, there was a hope that this would have been a watershed moment. We get many more African-American head coaches into the game, because by that time, the player population was about 70% African-American. 32 clubs, one African-American head coach. But in the years following Shell's hire, the numbers went up, maybe 2 to 3, down to 2, 1, 2, 3, just couldn't get higher than that. And then in 2001, there were 3 head coaches at the end of the season. 2 of them, Dennis Green, who had such success over many years with the Minnesota Vikings, was fired. 2 weeks later, Tony Dungy, who totally turned around horrendous Tampa Bay Buccaneers team. He was fired. Dungy, of course, now in the Hall of Fame, but he was fired then. So now we had one Black head coach of color in the league, one Black head coach, in the league, 70% of color, and a couple of lawyers decided that they had to intervene and threatened the league with a lawsuit. The league responded by not throwing up defenses, but instead inviting the lawyers and some of their friends in the NFL community in to sit down and talk about a way to move forward. And the way that the league chose to move forward was through this Rooney Rule concept. And so starting in 2003, you had to interview one head coach of color for every, or one coach of color for every head coaching opening. And you quickly saw an increase in the number of head coaches from 3 to 8 within 3 years. The rule applied to general managers as well at that point, from 1 to 3 to 6 in a couple of years. So there was substantial improvement with respect to diversity in the league in the early years of the Rooney Rule. Since then, there's been some real backsliding, which we can talk about later, but that's the origin of the rule, how it came to be, what it is, and how it operates.
Now, in its original application, and I'm going to jump over to Howard for this part, how, especially as someone within the media that has covered professional sports broadly, but especially with issues related to race, how was this rule manipulated by NFL teams in its first few years?
Well, it's the manipulation is a constant, simply because I think in any type of situation where you are forced by pressure, whether it was Al Sharpton, Johnny Cochran, the combination of the two to create this pressure in the first place, you're doing this unwillingly. And so it actually worked in two ways. One way that the Rooney Rule was manipulated was by having a number of coaches apply for jobs that were already taken. And so, and this is actually where Brian Flores actually, where his lawsuit finally was sort of the last straw, where you would have coaches in very, very difficult positions. It's a small business. It's a closed business. There's only, at the time, there were only 26 of those jobs. Now there are 32 of those jobs, or 28 of them. Now there's 32 of them. And everyone talks to each other. They all know where the jobs are going to go. They all know who's going to, who's a front runner for what. And so the way the rule had been manipulated in the first place had been a coach had been hired, and then they would, okay, wait a minute, we got to go interview we've got to go interview somebody to be in compliance with this rule. And so instead of the job process being a legitimate one, the black coaching candidates were in the very difficult situation of interviewing for jobs they knew they weren't going to get. And so then it sort of became, the Rooney Rules then turned into this training ground. Well, even if you're not going to get the job, it's good to be in front of these executives because you'll be in line for the next job. So you were in compliance, but you were never really, the teams were in compliance, but they were never really serious about hiring these black candidates. And what's very interesting about it is that the Rooney Rule originated with the Pittsburgh Steelers, with Dan Rooney, the owner, and the African-American head coach who succeeded Bill Cowher, Mike Tomlin, who's still the head coach, was not a Rooney Rule hire. He was not actually part of the Rooney Rule in the first place. So the level of success that the rule has had is, to me, one of the big problems with it is that it was supposed to translate into not just a raw numbers increase of hiring, but a respect for the coaches. That this rule was instituted for the purpose of one day being unnecessary. That once you brought in these coaches, once you saw these talented candidates, then you wouldn't be pressured into hiring them. You would know that the job pool had expanded, and that simply has not happened.
Thank you so much, Howard. And now, Amira, with regards to this application of the rule, what are some of the issues that you've seen and taken away that are probably some of the biggest impediments to it being done in a meaningful, legitimate way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to what Howard just said, and really what he said almost 10 years ago now, at the 10th anniversary of the implementation of this rule, that the rule itself is an indictment. It's an indictment on a league, on a league's culture that was not going to naturally do this and has no interest in doing it. And I think that really explains a lot of what we see in terms of coaching, Black coaches in the league, which is really a tale as old as time, right? The idea of needing Black labor in sporting spaces, but protecting your sideline, protecting your managerial box, right? And this fight for diversity, for inclusion, for getting into that sporting space has a long time been focused on the field, and then it kind of stops. And so with the Rooney Rule, one of the things that you have is this like idea of a trickle down approach that, as Howard said, it was supposed to expire its need, because these coaches would be coming in, and then it would trickle down to coordinators, to other opportunities. And what we know is that those pipelines are also deficient, whether people are getting stuck in them. We have this conversation every year. Why is Eric not getting hired? He just called this play. Where are these minds? Who has this strategic thinking? And it really comes down to who is understood to have the knowledge to be a coach, right? And so if we look at the pipeline and we see the number of people who are related to white head coaches in these coordinator positions, or coming in through these ways, we can see that there is clearly a pattern of how people think your pathway to being a coach is laid out. And prioritizing that sort of connection and networks and knowledge is to the impediment of not only former players who want to be coaches, but other people, especially Black people who come from non-playing backgrounds, like many white coaches do. They don't have those pathways at all. And so one of the things that happens when we talk about the Rooney Rule is we focus a lot at the top. And this was also a rule that was trying to fill a huge gapping structural issue that, even in the kind of performance of following the rule, isn't at all addressing what we're seeing in its implementation, which is that people are getting stuck at these positions, or they're getting pushed out of coaching entirely, and that it just keeps kind of regurgitating, which is why in the last 2 years, we have seen this kind of regret. I don't even know if we can say it's regression, maybe back to the norm, if you will. But more people, I feel like every January we have a conversation about its ineffectiveness, but we've been doing that for, 10, 15 years.
Now, Madhu, your entire playing career was with the Rooney Rule in existence. Could you maybe, before we get into what you've done post-playing career, get into the player perspective of how this rule has been implemented and still its lack of success in the coaching ranks?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind from my playing days is that the Rooney Rule really didn't make a dent of an impact. We didn't see it. We didn't benefit from it, because at the end of the day, with a league that is 70% African-Americans and a few number of head coaches that exist, and more importantly, the coordinators are not getting opportunities. And then you look at the front office, you see there's a sparingly limited amount of African-Americans who are in a general manager's position. To me, we have to look at it closely and see whether or not if this is there another alternative? And if there is, what is it? I also think about a conversation I used to have with Marvin Lewis in terms of my playing days, when he used to say, it's hard to implement a rule on 32 owners who are white in terms of who's going to run their business. There's no other business in the world that have policies in place that dictate who's going to run their business for them. And to me, it was looked upon as the Rooney Rule was a rule that does exactly that. And it was kind of disfavored by a lot of owners to some degree. And from a player perspective, I'm always disappointed every year when the hiring cycle comes out, and it's almost like playing music in chairs and guessing. If there's 7 or 8 open positions, as a former player who used to be in the locker room, I used to laugh, say, okay, how many you think is going to go to African-American this year? And it's almost like it was a running joke, but it goes to show the seriousness of the lack of hiring of African-American coaches, and the whole notion of not being qualified, I think, is an excuse. I think it's a concerted effort by the league to make sure that, owners specifically, when I say that, to not hire African-Americans. And now you see the shift from not only African-Americans, but younger white coaches. There's the Sean McVay effect that's taking place in the league right now, where everyone wants the next so-called genius, Sean McVay. You look at the Cincinnati hiring Taylor. You take a look at what's going on in Miami and Daniels. They want everyone to be younger, who's from that tree. So you take a look at, and he pushes some of the qualified African-Americans like Eric Bieniemy, who I think is a heck of a coach. but he's not getting the opportunity. So as a former player, is very disappointed. I'm very disappointed. But am I shocked? No, I'm not, because this has been the way things have been for a very long time.
And a quick follow-up to that as well, because at least in the case of Bieniemy, it seems to be the one of the largest continuing criticisms of him is that he doesn't actually call the plays. Yet we have coaches such as Kevin O'Connell, who's now in Minnesota as the head coach, who also didn't call plays. So your perspective then on the X's and O's and that piece of evaluating whether a coach can be a head coach.
Well, I think I don't buy that, because you take a look at the guy that was in Chicago that just got terminated. He was also Nagy. Nagy was also in Kansas City, and Nagy did not call the plays. He was the quarterback coach. You look at Kevin O'Connell, or you look at a guy like Mike McDaniel, who just got hired in Miami. He didn't necessarily call the plays. He worked with Kyle to call plays, and Kyle is not giving that responsibility to nobody, because that's how he made his bread and butter, and that's just how he made his name. So to me, I think that's another way of making excuses, to say, well, he didn't do this. But that is also, when you hear the excuses as to why a Black candidate is not hired, is oftentimes referred to, well, there's always a checklist that he or she, well, in this case, he has to adhere by, which is it's almost like they're moving the goalpost every single time. Well, he didn't do this. Well, you didn't do
they
this.
absolutely are moving the goalposts. And the other part of the conversation I just wanted to throw out there is that we're talking a lot about hiring, but even in why the rule was necessitated in the first place was about retention, was about firing. So if you're hiring people, but you're letting them go after 1 year, as we've seen in this cycle, we know that we have the data that shows us that second chances come fewer and far between for Black coaches. We know that there is less of a safety net, more room to be let go of for winning seasons. I mean, I would point this out about Bryant. He got the Dolphins to have winning seasons consecutively for the first time since I was a freshman in high school. Okay, like this is, the resume of what coaches are doing compared to how likely they are to be able to retain their job is just off. It's off kilter. And that's the under part of the conversation, because you can hire people, but if you're not going to support them, you're not going to retain them, then what is really happening here?
I'm glad that you brought up the statistics, Amira, because the statistics of double standards in the league have been around for as long as the league's been around when it comes to coaching. When the Rooney Rule was implemented, those lawyers that I described, Johnny Cochran and Cyrus Mary was the other one, they got a study done at University of Pennsylvania, labor economists, who showed that in the first year of coaching a team as a head coach, Black coaches won 2.7 more games than white coaches. In the year of termination, 1.3 more. Overall, they won more and went to the playoffs more often. That's 20 years ago. Brian Flores points out in his lawsuit that Black coaches, head coach tenure, on average 2.5 years. For white coaches, 3.5 years. After a winning season, Black coaches 25% likely to be terminated. White coaches 6% likely to be terminated. And as Amira pointed out, white coaches have a much better chance of getting a second job. So these are problems that have existed the whole time. I will say one thing, and turn it back to you, Ricky. A couple of people mentioned implementation of the Rooney Rule. And that's where I really feel the failing is. The actual concept of the rule, the idea that you open the door to invite in people to interview who otherwise are shut out. I think at core, it's a good idea, and we've seen it be effective in other contexts. So the city of Portland, Oregon has adopted what they call the Charles Jordan Standard. They based it on the Rooney Rule. When you're gonna get a bureau chief, like the chief of sanitation or the police chief or the chief of fire, you have to interview a person of color, you have to interview a woman, and you have to interview a person with a disability. And if you don't interview one of those three categories, you have to show cause as to why you couldn't find someone to interview. And 10 of the last 11 hires for bureau chiefs in Portland have fit in one of those three categories. So when the implementation is strong, I think there can be a positive result. The problem is clubs have, on the whole, as everybody said, not been implementing the rule.
Yeah, I think there are two issues with this. with this story, and it's, sometimes my eyes glaze over when we talk about these things, for two major reasons. I think the first one is we, as minorities especially, but also as part of the workforce, as a labor force, we are constantly in the position of believing in merit, in believing that the framework that we're discussing is merit-based in the first place. It is not merit-based. So when we're talking about statistics and we're talking about how this coach did this and we're talking about how, this executive did that and how this team won, none of it matters, because that's not the criteria that the league, that the teams are actually using. The teams are hiring who they want to hire. Bless you. And I think that now, obviously, that is a very depressing way to go, because what's the answer to that? How do you counter that? You always try to counter an injustice with merit. Well, here's why you deserve this, or why you should be in consideration. But I think that one of the biggest problems that you have in shaping these conversations is the coaches are always at a disadvantageous position, because their measure is different from the measure of the people doing the hiring. And so what do you do with that? That's the first thing. The second thing is the understanding of pressure, is that there's a constant, nothing takes place without pressure. Everything, that even if you want to go back before the Rooney Rule, if you want to go, 15 years before the Rooney Rule, the original push of pressure between 1920 for coaching, with Fritz Pollard and Paul Robeson playing in the original NFL, and 1989 when Art Shell got hired, was 1987, was Al Campanis. It was Al Campanis in his infamous "blacks lack the buoyancy and the necessities to be good swimmers or good coaches." If you look at what took place in terms of hiring in all the sports between 1987, when Campanis made that comment on the 40th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's debut, to about 1993, you had more coaches being hired in that short period than you had since. And so you had, I think, Dusty Baker and Don Baylor and Art Shell and Wayne Fonts, and all of a sudden, and Ray Rhodes, and all of a sudden, after Al Campanis said what he had to say, suddenly black coaches were being hired. And so once again, the real issue to me is trying to understand or find the different ways to have this dynamic not always be the response to pressure. And as long as that's part of the dynamic, then it's always going to be, okay, well, what can we do to kill this news cycle? What can we do to kill this news cycle? And then we go back to doing what we're used to doing.
So Howard, quick question then to put you on the spot. Do you think Lovie Smith would be the head coach of the Houston Texans had the lawsuit not been
That's
filed?
not him putting me on the spot. I mean, he wasn't getting that job. In fact, Lovie was probably not getting another head coaching job. And so, and I think everyone knows that. And I think one of the hard parts of this too, just from everybody on this panel, we've all essentially been in this position at some point in terms of having to explain your merit, explain why you should be when other folks aren't. Let's see your SAT scores, right? I mean, this is what we're really sort of talking about. No, and he wasn't going to get that job. And there were plenty of jobs they weren't going to get. And I think Madhu makes a great point when you're talking about pipeline as well. It's not just the hiring. It's who gets to have a career, who gets to have wealth. If you look at the years, I mean, if you look at the salaries, and you've got a bunch of coaches on the sidelines, and the public thinks they're all millionaires. Now, you're making $120,000 a year being a running backs coach. You're making $200,000. You're making, and it's a lot of money in some places, but not in the NFL. And so these are the issues. Like, if you really want to break down the entire thing, the coaching piece of it is a big piece because it's what we pay most attention to. But you also then have the opportunity to have more flexibility. If you have that job, like take Marvin Lewis, for example, was a coach for Cincinnati for 16 years. That's 16 years at about $1 million per. So if you look at what his generational wealth is, as opposed to someone who's not in that position, he's in a great position to have the flexibility to say yes or no for his future, which is opportunities that a lot of black coaches simply just don't get.
But the other thing that a career gives you is the chance to figure out how to be innovative in other ways. And so one of the things that happens when we talk structurally is we can look at Brian Flores as a great example of this, unfortunately, is like, if you know that you're getting into a position that is not guaranteed, that has a shorter, safety net behind you, how likely are you going to be to shake things up in other places of inequity about the coordinators you bring, the coaches you hire, the quarterbacks you start?
You're going to be safe every time.
You're going to be safe, which is why you had Brian get into it with Kenny Stills, right? At that, we're not going to protest. We're not going to speak out. We are going to be safe, from play calling to team building to how we show up, right? And I think that one of the things that when we talk about of how we take one rule and think about huge structural issue is it's easier to see it as a Band-Aid that, as Jeremi said, is in and of itself, right? Saying, hey, if you look at people, if you widen your gaze, you might find some things that we already knew was there, but now you know it. But as a structural issue, from top to bottom, for all of these kind of conversations we have, right? Talking about coaches, we can have another panel, and we do. We'll have a panel in 2 weeks, right? About quarterbacks. We'll have a panel in a week after that about talent recruitment, whatever. Like, we're going to keep doing that. And I think that it's all intertwined. And the more we have these conversations in an intertwined way, we can pull on some of these threads when we talk about implementation, when we talk about these roadblocks. A wider lens on that gets us closer to some of these kind of structural issues.
No, Amira, you make a really good point. I was going to say, I'll be real quick. Sorry about that. About safety and about being, taking the safe choice in the NBA during when Kaepernick was kneeling, and when you started to see more and more protest in the activist voice. A lot of people were saying, well, where are the black coaches? Why is it that Steve Kerr and Greg Popovich and Stan Van Gundy are the ones doing all the talking? Because the black coaches don't have that safe. I can't afford to be out front on this. Greg Popovich has got more wins than anybody who ever coached in the sports history. They've got an opportunity because they have a comfort, they have a security that the other coaches don't have.
And just to piggyback on that, Howard, one of the things about African-American coaches in the NFL too is the fact that typically when they are hired, they're not getting the premier jobs.
No, they're not.
And they're getting the jobs that
literally who wants to coach.
Well, you can ask yourself the question, right? Over all the sports. I mean, I don't want to bring in hockey, but Dusty Baker and I talk about this all the time. How many black coaches get a Cadillac, right? How many black coaches get a job where you're ready to win right now? That's one of the reasons Dusty took scandal-ridden Houston. I mean, that job was a disaster because of the cheating scandal, but he said to me, they can win right now. we don't have many opportunities where you could actually, and look what happened. Within 2 years, he's in the World Series.
Yeah. I think, Howard, only in the NFL, one of the jobs that come to mind is the Steelers.
Tony as well, because they had Peyton Manning when he went to Indianapolis.
Correct.
They were ready to win.
It's rare, and it's few in between. So you take a look at Steve Wilkes when he took over in the Cardinals within a year, but that team was a disaster. It was a disaster. And you take a look at Raheem Morris when he was a first-year coach in Tampa Bay. They were purging all of the veterans, and they were doing a rebuild.
Well, that's right. And what ends up happening, there, the second thing, and you see it even more in baseball and to another extent in basketball, but really in football because the numbers are so tight. How are you going to get another job when you've got a career record of 12-40?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, no one's going to look at you as to say, how do you sell that to your fan base?
Yeah.
Particularly if they tell you to lose on purpose.
and then when you add that element to it as well.
And that's what's in my opinion, that's what's hurting Leslie Frazier. Leslie's a heck of a coach, but when you take a look at his record, once he was a head coach, how can a GM or owner sell his record to the fan base?
Yeah, here's the savior. Here's you can't. Even Bill Belichick, when he got hired by the Patriots, you look at the team that he had a great team. All those guys were on the '96 Super Bowl team that lost to the Packers. So he had a core there, and then suddenly he ended up with Tom Brady as well, and so things take off. So it's not as though he built that team from the ground up. So there are very few coaching jobs. Now, obviously, you make the argument that, well, you're making a change because the team's not very good. That's not always the case. It's just that you needed a different voice. But when a black coach gets involved, chances are that team is really, really, really not very close to winning.
Yeah, and you guys have now kind of provided a great segue here into the Brian Flores suit in particular. And I do want to throw out one quick statistic because Amira, you especially alluded to it. So when Brian Flores was fired, his career record, 24, 25, and 1, which I think for at least for me and many others was part of why it was so surprising that he was fired, given that his team went from 5-11 to, they won their last 8 games prior to him being fired. Switch it over to Arizona real quick before we get into the suit, where Cliff Kingsbury, who's another one of those, supposed young phenom coaches, we have a career record of 25 and 25, and he was just handed an extension. So Brian Flores, 24, 25 and 1, fired, and now as a linebackers coach, Cliff Kingsbury, 25 and 25, with a substantially better quarterback, mind you, 25 and 25, and given an extension. So it is obviously not the only example, but does provide a quick sample look into the differences. Now the Flores suit in particular, Jeremi, again, I'm going to have you tee this up for us, especially because you were the one that sent me a text within, I think, like 30 seconds of the news breaking. But so Brian Flores, class action lawsuit focusing on racial discrimination and racial discrimination in particular within their hiring practices. Take us through the importance and potential impact of this suit.
Sure. So it was a very substantial, I think for most people, even people who study the space, a surprising lawsuit. It wasn't surprising, what the underlying statistics that he offered that I described earlier, those weren't surprising. Anyone who studies the space knows about those double standards. But it was surprising that he was willing to step up and publicly accuse the league of discrimination, first of all, but then to do it in a lawsuit, extremely surprising. It took a great deal of courage. And I'm going to shout out one of Howard's books, one of my favorite books of the foundation of the space, is a book called Shut Out, about the Boston Red Sox and race in Boston. Great book, Howard, I love it. But he tells a story, Howard does, about this gentleman, Tommy Harper, who was a coach, a player and a coach with the Red Sox, who as a player and as a coach realized that during spring training, all the white players and coaches got to go to the Elks Club for dinner, and all the black players and coaches didn't. And he saw it as a player. He came back as a coach. It was still going on. He saw it for a couple of years. Finally, a Boston Globe reporter asked him about it. And he said, yeah, it's been going on for however many years. And as Howard describes in the book, the next day he walks into the clubhouse and it's like a bomb dropped. Nobody's talking to him. By the end of the season, he's out of the organization. Next year, 1986, he's working at an auto body shop while the Red Sox are going to the World Series. And he can hear it he can hear Fenway Park from where he is. So I bring up that story because I believe that his experience hung over Black coaches in professional sports in this country like a big, ugly rain cloud. And there was tremendous fear of stepping up, putting your head up, and accusing a league of racial discrimination for fear that you would be out. And so for Brian Flores to bring this suit showed tremendous courage in my view. And I have to say that and you point out he's a linebackers coach now, and with that question, he is underemployed. But that the Steelers hired him and he was able to get back in the league within 1 month. I don't know if anybody expected that. And I think perhaps there will be a new narrative about being able to raise your hand and say, hey, this discrimination is going on, and it may not be the end of your career. But that's why it's a critically important lawsuit. In terms of where it goes from here, the other thing that I wanted to say is that we talked about his success with the Dolphins. Amira gave those numbers. But at the end of the 2020 season, he was third in voting for the AP Coach of the Year. And at the end of the season, he just got fired. 4 weeks before he was fired, go back and Google it. All the articles are talking about this guy's a head coach of the year candidate. So without question, it was an unjust termination. His allegations are that you've got league-wide discrimination set out in the statistics, that he himself suffered discrimination when he sought to be the head coach of Denver Broncos. He says that the Broncos brass came to interview him an hour late and disheveled as if they'd been drinking. The Broncos strongly deny it, but that's his allegation. He talks about basically in Miami, as I referenced earlier, being told to lose. And his theory is that he was being told to lose. And he alleges the owner was going to pay him to lose, and that he'd lose for a year or two. That would be grounds to fire him. And then they bring in a white coach is essentially his allegation there. So he alleges racial discrimination with respect to termination. And he alleges racial discrimination with respect to the Giants' interview process of him, where, as it's been reported widely, Bill Belichick sent him a text basically saying, hey, congratulations on getting the job 3 days before he interviewed for the job. And he says to Belichick, who he worked for 15 years, who's a mentor, coach, you sure you're writing to the right person? And Belichick said, I messed up. He used more colorful language, where he says, I messed up. And really the thought was Brian Dable, who ended up getting the job, was the person who get the job. This is before Flores even interviewed. So Flores did ultimately interview, did not get the job. Dable got the job. And I think that was about the last straw for him. So he put together these league-wide discriminatory statistics in his own experiences, and he filed a federal lawsuit.
And just real quick to press down on one other component of it, it was an open-ended class action suit too, which is critical.
Yes, thank you, Ricky. So it's an open-ended class action suit. His lawyers were on Real Sports on HBO a week ago, implying strongly that a number of other Black coaches were thinking about coming out and joining the class. We'll see how that class develops. Basically, a class action lawsuit is one in which you have a named plaintiff, in this case, Brian Flores, suing on behalf of an entire class of Black coaches and executives and former Black coaches and executives in the league who believe they were discriminated against because of race.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge piece of it for two other reasons. And I think number one, it speaks to you're essentially indicting the history of coaching in the NFL. That's a big deal. The second reason why it's a big deal is that this is a closed business. And once again, when you lift your head up, the lawnmower, you get run over, right? You're going to get your head chopped off. And so what is happening now, what Brian Flores has unleashed, is we'll find out how many players in the league are willing to risk their careers by joining this. Because the minute you put your name on that, you're in jeopardy. Your career is in jeopardy. And say what you want about Brian Flores getting in with Pittsburgh as a linebackers coach. It's a great move. It's good. It's better to be in the league than out of the league, because once again, it's a closed business. If Visa doesn't want to hire me, I can go work for MasterCard. You can't do that in the NFL. It's one business. And so that is it's a very big deal. And I think the other problem that you're going to see here is the trotting out of the coaches that want to have a career in the NFL. There'll be some form of divide and conquer there, where it's like, well, everybody treated me fine here. I think what I really want to see more than anything else, and to Madhu's point, as he was in that room, is, hey, 70% Black players, you are Brian Flores. When your career is over, if you want to be a head coach, this is your fight too. So the idea that that this is a coaching issue, it's not a coaching issue, it's a racial issue. So this lawsuit changes dramatically if you see Pat Mahomes get involved, if you see Lamar Jackson get involved, you see the highest profile players, and then you see them in volume get involved. And that would be significant if you saw that level of involvement from the players, because the players are the ones people pay attention to.
Speaking of the players, real quick, not to get too far off course here, but we do have one question from the audience from Kevin Carpenter, and I'll leave this open-ended here. Could you explain why Colin Kaepernick settled his claims, and how does the legacy of his actions and his lawsuit against the NFL impact the NFL and Flores' suit today?
All right, who wants to take that one? I mean, I'll jump. I mean, for me, I think part of the reason I think Colin settled was because it was a jobs issue. I think people asked a lot of Colin Kaepernick. They were asking him to do and be everything. He was fighting for back pay. He didn't have a job. And so I felt like it made sense for him, in a very narrow sense, for him to have an objective and to win that objective, which was to settle for the wages that he didn't get when he would have been playing. On the other hand, I understood that there were people who felt like, hey, if you don't open this door the way Brian Flores is in terms of discovery, in terms of finding out what these guys know, then what was this all about in the first place? So I understood both sides on Colin's case, but I also understood that, hey, this was a back wages lawsuit when he sued them. And whatever that settlement was, I understood his reasoning for settling.
Madhu, I think you had your hand raised as well.
Howard, I also think part of it also, Colin wanted to come back in the league to some extent. I also think he had desires of wanting to continue his career, and the best path forward or whatever he was advised was for him to settle at some degree with the NFL to come to an agreement so he can move forward. But the damage was already done, and he goes back to what you said, Ricky, in terms of setting up for the follow-up question. The damage has already been done. The fact that he stepped out there and he filed a lawsuit against the NFL, and he can scream collusion all he wants, but he has to prove collusion, and it's very difficult for you to do that. Mm-hmm. And with that being said, it would have been highly unlikely that he was going to get back in the league. Highly unlikely. And I think after a while, he realized that his career was over, or he would have been advised from the folks that are close to him to realize, hey, man, if you move forward with this, there's a potential you never play football again. And at that time, I think knowing Colin from my year of playing with him, he was at peace with realizing that potentially he may not ever play again.
And getting into one of the more technical components of both the Kaepernick suit as well as the Flores suit is the component that hangs over all of this of the NFL attempting to compel arbitration and keeping a lot of this out of the public eye. Jeremi, do you think that's going to be one of the next steps for the NFL into, like, as they've now done in the John Gruden lawsuit, where they have filed a motion to compel arbitration? Do you think something similar is going to happen in the Flores suit?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if they didn't move to compel arbitration. And, we'll see what ultimately happens. So in the NFL Constitution and bylaws, which are referenced to in every head coach's contract, and we assume Flores as well, there's an obligation to go to arbitration rather than to bring a lawsuit if you have a dispute with a club or a league. In this particular situation where the arbitral panel is Commissioner Goodell or someone he appoints, I think that it's possible that a court would view that to be just too unleveled a playing field to explore this allegation that deals with some deep societally concerning issues. And so I could see it potentially staying out of arbitration. If it goes to arbitration, one of the major consequences is that Howard mentioned discovery. Discovery is a process whereby one party gets information from the other party about everything that's relevant to it, but it also is a process during which there are a bunch of motions that get into the public record. The reporters get their hands on them and they're in the press. If it goes into arbitration, everything is behind a closed door. Nobody knows about any of this stuff. And that's why the league wants to go to arbitration. That's why Flores is going to fight not to go to arbitration.
And to press on one other issue, and Madhu, you can also jump in on this as another fellow JD on here. In terms of, so we saw that in the St. Louis suit as well, which I know, again, not related to coaching, but the NFL was doing everything possible to keep this information out of discovery. With regards to this particular situation, though, with Flores, part of his suit is not technically arising out of an existing contractual relationship. So with John Gruden, clearly him resigning from his position with the Raiders, he had a contract with the Raiders. The NFL Constitution likely applies. But with Flores, and in particular with the Giants and the Broncos component of this suit, there wasn't an existing contract. So would either of you say that that's maybe another way that this stays out of arbitration?
Well, I would say that it was deliberate in Brian Flores' part, especially in his exit interview when he had the opportunity to sign the contract to kind of keep things on the lid, but also continue to get paid. And he decided not to get paid and decided not to sign the contract because he realized that if he did, that will potentially hinder his ability to potentially file a lawsuit down the road. So I think that was very strategic in his part.
Yeah, right. So because he is, I think, I don't know how much money he said he was offered, but hundreds of thousands of dollars to sign a NDA, non-disclosure agreement, and he opted not to do it so that he could go publicly on record with his grievances.
Yeah, I think one of the other pieces of this that is problematic for me, and it is what it's going to be, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it because this is the situation that Black coaches find themselves in. But the idea that every grievance you have is putting your entire career in jeopardy, that anytime you want to talk about your workplace issues, I mean, anything that you're discussing, you are risking everything you built. And when you think about these guys, I mean, they've been playing football since they were 6 years old. And this is what they've been doing. This is their identity. This is their life. And I'm sure, Madhu, you know this as well as anybody, one of the hardest things in the world to do is to separate that identity and having a second act. What is my second act? Who am I without this? And who am I without this when this is so high profile? It's not just changing jobs. I'm a teacher and I'm going to go into real estate. This is the NFL. Everybody is watching this. You are a somebody when you're in this league. And people look to you very, very differently. I mean, I think I'm a very interesting person. I think people like me. I think they should like me. However, I know my friends treat me very differently because I'm connected to something they really, really love, right? Because you're involved in high-profile professional sports. And so, I mean, I get it. I understand why if you're a Colin Kaepernick, if you're a Raheem Morris, if you're the long forgotten Sherm Lewis. Remember Sherman Lewis? He was the Eric Bieniemy of the 90s. Oh, he's going to be the next head coach. And you all have to stay quiet and you all have to keep your mouth shut because you know that once this thing gets taken away, they're not going to let you back in. So it's really problematic for me that so many of these coaches or these people in this business are faced with this choice that they can't even, and that tells you a lot about ownership. Ownership means you can say what you want. These players and these employees in this business are really in a pressurized situation.
Which is also why when you do get people talking, some people feel like, oh, it's a list of grievances. Yeah, because it's a built up time. You finally are going to talk, you're going to talk, And so I think we see that. I think a lot of people ask when we push it towards implementation, what can be done? How do we get it, not reactive, et cetera. And I think, obviously, because I'm a historian, I think this, but I think also looking at other leagues and stuff like that is instructive because this is an issue happening in the NFL, very high profile, but it's also something that we see across many sports, as Howard was talking baseball earlier. I've been covering this a lot about Black women coaches in women's basketball, for instance, which you have the same kind of numbers. The disparity is ridiculous. The merit arguments don't move the needle, even though they are completely statistically bolstering the resumes of Black women in those positions. What you saw move the needle in one conference in the SEC was South Carolina going all in on Don Staley. I'm not talking about the new contract I'm talking about before, in which that idea of having one person in there who then breaks these kind of offers a blueprint that, Black women can talk to donors, they're strategic thinkers, et cetera, gave license across the SEC after winning, right? That all of a sudden the SEC has 6 of their 12 coaches are Black women. But again, if we don't focus on the retention part of that conversation, last year there was a bundle of articles about how 6-7 coaches in that league were Black. There was a net loss of 3 in that conference. Outside of that conference, in the rest of the Power 5, there's 2. And so we're talking about a numbers game where sometimes it's very easy to be like, here are gains, but those losses are just as revealing. And the part of this lawsuit that's so significant is the collective action, because collective action historically has been one of the things that applies pressure and sustains pressure. And the hardest thing that so many people deal with across leagues, across sports, is how you maintain that pressure, that collective pressure, in a space that Black bodies in particular are so disposable, are so easy to be pushed aside, whether your playing days are over, whether you're not going to get hired again, whatever it is. How do you build collective with people who are transient in a sporting space, even if we feel like they're fixed? And I think that that's one of the things that the hope of the lawsuit with that part is an opportunity to have that collective pressure. The question becomes, how do we maintain that? How do we, bring that to the fore?
Yeah, I think one of the one of the positives. Oh, go ahead. Who's going?
Howard is me. One of the things I just wanted to ask, and I just want to pose it to the panel, is what have we thought about the Black coaches who are kind of upset with the fact that Brian Flores even filed the lawsuit?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Who are disappointed because now he's let the cookie out the cookie jar.
Well, he's putting them in a different
exactly.
Exactly.
You ruined this for us.
Well, and you're risking my career.
You're risking my career.
That's right. Well, and that shows you.
Yeah. You by your actions are causing me harm.
Well, that's right. And I was going to say, I think that there's a positive and negative to what Amira was saying. One of the negatives that really bothers me about this is the overemphasis on money. In that there are plenty of businesses in this country where the predominant workforce is a minority or are women, right? I mean, seriously, there are plenty. Go out to California and go see who's picking your strawberries, right? It's a brown, it's a bunch of brown people doing all the work. And we never say, well, how come there aren't more Mexican CEOs, running these agribusinesses, right? We don't do that. We don't do that for any other business. Why do we do it for sports? Because the players make so much money. But comparatively speaking, they don't make that much money compared to what it takes to buy a team. And I think somebody in the Q&A had said, okay, well, what's it going to take? And do we need more Black or female owners? It's a math question. You have to do the math in terms of how much the valuations of these franchises are. These players are creating a business that is making it even more difficult for them to buy into it because of their popularity. So they are fueling the disparity they're fueling a greater disparity for them to get into these ownership ranks. Now, the positive in that is that we are suggesting that, yes, there should be a pipeline between the worker and ownership, that it should reflect, that the front office should reflect who plays the game, who's doing the work. And I think there is a lot of value in that. But it is interesting to me that professional sports really is the only industry where people look at it and say, well, gee, the NBA is 80% Black. How come there aren't 80% Black coaches or 80% Black owners? They don't do that for any other industry. And the reason is because of the overemphasis on their salaries. We think that those mega salaries are going to translate into power when they really don't.
No.
Which is why sports thinking, understanding, this is the last thing I'm going to say, I gotta go. But it's why thinking is sports as labor is so instructive, not for sports in and of itself, right? But for actually labor organizing across the board. Some of the biggest labor wins has been in women's sports, just generally, right? I'm not talking about biggest labor wins in women's sports. I'm talking about biggest labor wins. And when we disaggregate sports from labor and athletes from workers, it breaks down these possibilities of power, saying about how we see these other labor forces. And so there's actually a really pristine moment in these arbitrations, in these things, to remind folks, like Howard was saying about Colin, that's back pay. This is work. This is labor. And if we understand this to be labor, how can we better understand labor organizing, which underpins and has underpinned so many movements for civil rights in this country, but it's something that we just have a collective general lack of understanding about in a way that really stunts a lot of movements today. Okay, now I'm done.
Thank you so much, Amira. I know you've got to drop off, and to the extent our other panelists are able to stick around for a few minutes, I still do want to touch on the integrity part of this. So talking about the disparities between ownership and the labor component, it's not necessarily a direct apples to apples comparison, but we saw this week with Calvin Ridley versus now Stephen Ross. So Jeremi gave us the quick summary of Flores's allegations. One of them, most critically, was that Stephen Ross actually, again, allegedly, offered $100,000 bonuses to coaches and team executives for losing. Because here in the United States, for those of you that are abroad, tanking is a popular thing among sports teams in the US, because then it puts them at the top of player drafts and allows them to acquire theoretically the top talent at a much cheaper and affordable price. So there is a strategic component to it, but offering up $100,000 per loss seems to potentially cross a line that hasn't been crossed before, at least to the best of our knowledge. So meanwhile, we have Calvin Ridley, though, who made several prop bets, $1,500. Obviously, those are explicitly against the uniform player contract in the NFL. That part is not an argument here. It's explicitly against the rules of the NFL. However, looking at the differences in how Calvin Ridley, who's now been suspended indefinitely for a minimum of 1 year, Stephen Ross, billionaire owning the Miami Dolphins, happy down in Miami. Maybe we could dive in a little bit into the difference there, and also the implications on what Ross did from a sport integrity standpoint and how that might create some criminal and possibly civil liability.
Well, I think for starters, Ricky, one of the biggest difference, and is just on the surface, is the fact that Ridley's, you can actually have tangible evidence, whereas Stephen Ross, when I say tangible evidence in the by way of Twitter or text message, whatever platform he was using to actually see, he actually placed the bet himself, and it's traceable. And he admitted it. It's traceable. It's traceable. You can trace his IP address to his phone and things of that nature. Whereas with Stephen Ross, it's more of a conversation. It's hearsay. It's hearsay, and that is the major difference between the two. When you talk about integrity, in Stephen Ross' case, Brian Flores has to prove it.
Yeah, no doubt. And Jeremy, were you going to go on that?
No, go ahead, Howard.
I was just going to say also, and you have to think about where we are right now, and where we are over the last 6-7 years, and certainly over the last 2, is everyone has gone all in on gambling on these sports, and they knew this money was coming. There was a Godfather moment in Major League Baseball where Tony Clark, the executive director of the Players Association, and Rob Manfred and the management team over at the commissioner's office, they essentially did a presentation and said, here's what's coming. As soon as in New Jersey, New York betting, as soon as that law comes to pass and it's fair game, here are the potential dollars. Remember the scene in The Godfather where they're splitting up the table. Okay, well, drugs will be permitted and controlled, right? They know this is coming. And when Sonny says there's a lot of money in that white powder, everybody knows this is billions of dollars, and we have to get in on this. And if we don't get in on this, somebody else will. And that's why Roger Goodell can come out and say, well, we see the NFL's revenues at $25 billion over the next 10 years. They know this money was coming over the mountain. And so that money in some ways has always been right over the hill. But the question had been, we can't do this. We can't do this because the games are being threatened. If people don't believe it's a fair contest, no one's going to watch. But suddenly, we live in a very cynical time and a very different time. We live in a time now where people have been gambling privately for decades. We live in a time where people are gambling without calling it gambling through fantasy sports. And we live in a time where people have now decided to identify more with front offices than they do with players. And in doing that, whether it's the Philadelphia 76ers or the Houston Astros or the Miami Dolphins, the fan bases want you to lose so you can go get the next great player. So they don't necessarily view it as a crime. Now, when you have Brian Flores come out and saying what he's saying, that it's a systematic thing where the owner is actually compensating you, allegedly, to lose games, at a time when now you've got bettors saying, well, wait a minute, I'm actually putting money down on this, then that dynamic, that equation really does change. And that, to me, in reading that Flores lawsuit, when I thought that, obviously I thought that the import of it was what Flores was doing, but the damage was that piece. And that's where Stephen Ross could lose his team.
Yeah,
because
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Nobody, we first got the complaint, everybody reached through it. One of these things seems not like the others. You got all this racial discrimination stuff, and
then you've got bang.
It was just a huge, and the rule is that the commissioner has the authority to stiffly penalize anybody in the league who engages in conduct detrimental to the integrity of the game. And if it's the case, and Madhu made the point, there's no evidence at this point, but let's say evidence turns up. If it's the case that there is evidence that Stephen Ross did this, it's hard to imagine anything that would be more detrimental to the integrity of the game. And I'm with Howard. I think that, it could force him out of the league, and it would be hard to see how
Jerry Richardson lost his team with Carolina.
Yeah.
Right? That was for less.
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily less, but if you're talking about bottom line dollars, I mean, and obviously that's not the goal to declare victory because Stephen Ross gets kicked out of the league? Not really, but it would certainly say something. It would be a signal when you're talking about integrity that, yes, we are aware. And then you add Ridley to this, and you add Shaw a couple of years ago in 2019. I was always worried about the gambling piece of this, that you were going to create a structure where everybody is in on this. And you sell this, and ESPN and the other networks are going in on DraftKings, and everybody's doing this right now. And it's being embedded in the coverage. I'm watching a tennis match, and you're talking about the odds makers, in the first set. I mean, so it's all right there. But what we're going to do is when the players do something, we're going to throw the book at them and leave the system intact. And so this is the challenge for the players, because the players absolutely know you cannot do this.
Correct.
But the league also knows you cannot do this. But the league is doing it anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's important for the audience to realize that the NFL goes through a great length to educate players on gambling. There's seminars that are being had during the season and training camp and during the off season to dissuade players from participating in gambling and betting on games, whether it's your team or another team. They just don't want players to do it. So that's why it's such a huge deal that Calvin Ridley not only participated, but betted, I think, on his own team when he was injured. It's a very difficult situation. And I think it just screams integrity, because what it does, it's you start looking at performances that Calvin Ridley might not have performed at his best. Yeah. And it questions whether or not the Atlanta Falcons as a team, are there other players? So it just turns a bad eye on the league as a whole, and player performances are being heightened to see whether or not they have so-called gambling issues.
Well, anybody knows. Anybody who's ever played professional sports, anyone who's ever played sports, period, knows at their level, at a world-class level, you can throw a game in a heartbeat. You can throw a game. I mean, Madieu, you know this. What's the line in Any Given Sunday? 1 second too slow or too fast, you don't quite make it, right? You guys know how to make it look good. You know when you're over hustling and your teammates make fun of you for over hustling, or when you're under hustling and you don't catch a ball, you don't make a play.
Right.
When you read the Black Sox testimony, you can fool the public, but you can't fool yourself. And so when you start getting into these questions, you're in huge trouble. Unless it's going to just turn into wrestling, where nobody cares if it's legit or not. And that, in some ways, is the risk. That it doesn't matter whether or not there's money on the game. It doesn't matter whether or not this player was cheating or that player, because it's not cheating anymore. It's just a game. It's just entertainment. And that is a place that the NFL has not been willing to risk. But potentially it's heading down that road when you have stories like this. And when I say stories like this, I'm not talking just Ridley. I'm talking Ridley plus Ross.
Yeah, and I for the audience, for your sake, I did just plug in a relevant section from the Sports Bribery Act, which it is worth noting that in its history since 1964, the U.S. government has taken up less than 20 actions under this act. But at least in my reading of it, if it's ultimately shown that Stephen Ross did indeed offer $100,000 to players and coaches and front office personnel for losses that I think it's pretty clear that would meet the definition of what is attempting to be prevented with the Sports Bribery Act. There's also a relevant statute in the state of Florida, which is where the Miami Dolphins are located, which also would seem to be applicable. So final question, guys, for you from the audience, and then I'll let everybody get back to their mornings or afternoons, depending on where you are. If this Flores suit is ultimately proved successful and he ultimately is able to at least prove some of these allegations, now I know success could have a pretty broad spectrum there. Do you think this could finally be the watershed moment for minority coaches that people have been looking for decades? Or do you think it's just sort of another chapter in a longer book?
I'll say, I think it's the latter. I think it will be big. And you mentioned you can define success in different ways, and you certainly can. There's settlement before discovery, there's settlement after discovery, there's going to the jury and winning at a jury trial. I think it's highly unlikely it'll get there. I think it'll settle at some point. But when that happens in any of those three scenarios, it's important to note that Brian Flores seeks not only unspecified damages, but programmatic relief in his lawsuit, relief aimed toward increasing diversity at the highest echelons of the National Football League. And so I think it would be meaningful. But one thing I've learned as somebody who studied this space, sport and race, but also just America and race, is that it is always a chapter in the longer book. To think that this would somehow be the moment where the light shines down and there's equal opportunity, I think would be naive.
Yeah. I echo what Jeremi just said, and my sentiment is that this will be another chapter in the book. I envision that looking at the history of the NFL with lawsuits of this nature, they will settle rather than risk the public scrutiny. And Brian Flores will not, I don't foresee him having another head coaching job in the NFL. And from a NFL coach's perspective, I think owners will be leery in the type of actions and the way they act during interviews and potentially bringing on minority coaches. And I don't think his actions, I think, will heighten the awareness of what is taking place during the interviews. And I think it would allow more owners to be more cautious and in terms of how they approach minorities and the questions and the decorum that takes place.
Yeah, I agree across the board. And I think that you may, in the short term, even see a chilling effect because the coaches, one, they don't trust the players anyway. Two, they certainly don't trust the black players. And three, they really aren't going to trust the black players or the black coaches if those black coaches are considered to be enemy camp or if they're recording what's being said in these wink, wink, nudge, nudge clubs that they're in. That, oh no, I can't say this because it'll end up in a lawsuit at some point. So it may even have a worse effect of freezing out some of those coaches because what we know about the league is that, and about most of these businesses, is that you're not part of this. It is always pressure that is getting you in the room. They don't necessarily trust you being in the room. And especially in a sport like the NFL where the numbers bear that out. And also the level of nepotism in that sport is so high in terms of coaching and everything else. I just think that what we're going to see here is we're going to see how this plays out on its own. But I don't see a lot of collective will right now on the part of the NFL to change how it does business. And that's why people focus so much on ownership. It's like, okay, well, how does that piece of it change? And that's the piece where I end up being a little bit more pessimistic because the dollars that it takes to buy into this is so enormous that the actual people who run the club continue to run the club.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I really appreciate all of you giving us some of your valuable time this morning. And again, thanks to Amira. I know she had to jump off. Appreciate everybody in the audience and especially Sean and Law and Sport for allowing us to set this up today for what I think was a wonderful discussion. But yeah, so thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, all the rest of the speakers. Really appreciate it. I think with agreement of the speakers, we'll be putting the recording on our podcast and on YouTube. So if you want to share that with other people afterwards, please do. Thank you so much for your questions. And I hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Brilliant discussion.
Thanks, everybody.
Guys.
All right.
Take care, guys.
Bye.